Yourself.
Very well. Super excited because today we're going to be chatting about empowering sales teams. So, right now, at the moment, I think one of the most talked about things is obviously sales, business development across recruitment founders, across our community, and what people are talking about. We've obviously went through our sort of post-COVID boom where it was all fill, delivery, delivery, delivery. We're now in this sort of correction phase where we need to upskill certainly all the people that we brought on to be more sort of sales and business development focused. But we also need to better support billing managers, founders, directors, people of all level that have a management responsibility as to how they can help their team do that. So, how can they really sort of track what they need to and track the right things when it comes to sales and business development? How do they gather the information together? So it's not really hard and cumbersome for them to do that. And then more importantly, I suppose, how do they actually implement it? How do they make that information sort of effective? So the first thing I wanted to kind of talk about today was really about the whole, what should we start pulling together? What should managers look at? What are the key things right now, sales,
Mm.
business development focused, that they should be invested in?
Yeah, I mean, before we get into that, it's a really interesting time because for years I've always asked the question to a lot of recruiters, do you consider yourself a salesperson? And many would say no,
Yeah.
because it's considered very consultative. It's not really like a sales outbound-esque role. But what I love is with the move we're going into now, though it's kind of a result of tougher times, we are seeing more of a move towards how software companies have done things, right? Where there is still that consultative element, but there's also a very hard BD sales focused function. And so over the years, when the odd client of ours has said to me, oh, we're using HubSpot, which is a CRM in the software space for BD, but we use Bullhorn for our ATS, where I've got one of our clients last week messaging me saying, hey, we've just hired an SDR, which is called a sales development rep, basically a meeting booker in the software world. I've hired one of them, but for recruitment, and I said, hey, can you just give us kind of a rundown on how you do things? We're at that stage now where I think a lot of recruiters are starting to say, okay, then what does good BD look like? And very thankfully, software has been doing this now for 10, 15, 20 years, right?
Yeah.
And very much is at the bleeding edge of how can we do it even better. So there's so many lessons that we can kind of learn from in software. I think companies like us, companies like many others out there who have walked that path already, they've already kind of cut down the hedge and all the rest to
Yeah.
march on forwards. You can just literally follow the path they've been on. So there's so much we can take away from that. So on the subject of what you can track, essentially, as you've already said, it's a big topic at the moment, lots of lessons that they can take from software. So I really want to get into a little bit of that. We ran an analysis recently across our 275 plus recruiters that use our platform, right? And just to kind of give a quick intro, OneUp sales, analytics, gamification, TV displays in your office, we collect a lot of data basically. So we have really good info on how companies are performing, what they're tracking for targets, all that kind of good stuff. But across these 275 recruiters, we looked at what were the most common targets they were using. And it'll probably not surprise anyone, but interviews and CVs were top dog. They're what I've called for the longest time the golden metrics in recruitment. And at a core level, they are very similar to two metrics or moments that we have in the software sales process. One of those being when a demo gets booked with a prospect or someone who might buy your solution. And then also a prospect wanting to talk further after that demo when it becomes what we call an opportunity to close a deal, right?
Yeah.
So in software, we'd liken CVs to a demo being booked. The salesperson booking that meeting believes there's a match between the problem your solution solves and the problems that your company you're booking with has. So the problem solver is the candidate. The problem at the company you believe that you can solve a problem for is very much the job, right? And that's a very simple, clear-cut description. When you look at interviews, that's you validating the assumption that you've made when you said, I believe we can solve your problem with this product or this candidate, right? So in software, sometimes the prospect won't show up for the demo. And that's exactly the same as a client ignoring the CVs that you've sent out to them. Happens a lot, I can imagine. I definitely know I've done it sometimes. I apologize to the recruiters we've worked with. In software, we would call that your no-show rate. And many software companies focus very heavily on this. That basically is just looking at, right, someone's booked in to come to a meeting, they don't show up. What percentage does that sit at? And generally it's 80% plus for most companies. That's a more kind of what I would call a level 2 metric. So we'll come back to that a little bit later on.
Okay.
But
Nice.
sometimes you do your demo and the prospect either proves to either not be within your criteria for what a good account looks like for you to close as a deal, or they just don't have a problem that you can solve despite what the person who booked the meeting said. And there's always this really interesting debate between two types of roles that you get in software. Very common for us to have a 180 model where you have your SDRs, the meeting bookers, and AEs or account executives, those that close those deals. A number of times that you'll hear an SDR say, oh, that account was definitely right for us. And the AE goes, no, it's not, because they're not like this. They haven't got this many seats. They're not using that CRM, whatever it might be. This is kind of that step again where there's a mismatch between expectation versus what the client's actually getting. So you're saying, I've got great candidates I'm going to send you. And the client goes, they aren't great candidates, right? Yeah. Very similar in software to when the SDR books in the meeting and goes, yeah, this is going to be a fine deal. And the AE going, no, they're not matching what we want. And again, in software, we have a term for that. That's called your qualification rate. So SDR goes, I believe this is right. AE will then check it on the demo and go, yep, that's qualified. I believe it matches all the criteria that we have. That's your qualification rate. So assuming your demo then goes well and the prospect can see how you can help them, then that becomes what we call, like I said earlier on, an opportunity, right? An opportunity to close. A further meeting gets booked in, you start talking to them. And to me, that matches up to what an interview is. It's the client accepting that a candidate you sent to them could solve their problem, which is the job opening they've got, and they therefore want to explore it further. So for me there, just to pause for a second, CVs, interviews, no surprise to anyone, are the golden metrics of recruitment. It validates that your belief that the CV you're sending is correct for an interview being booked. Yeah. Like, you absolutely have to have that as your number one focus in all metrics that you capture. Now, there's so many layers to that. You have spec CVs, you have second interviews, final interviews, all the rest of it. But generally, first interviews and CVs, top dog. Yeah. And then other metrics around that all give context, right? So I'll pause there for a second first. I'm curious on your thought as well. Do you think they are the most important to you from what you see? Do you think others really weigh in as well? I have a list of other metrics to go through, but I want to know what else you might say first.
Yeah, no, I definitely think they are. I think like the ratio elements of it is really important. I think people don't necessarily go into all of that. So they go, oh, great, we've sent out this number of spec CVs, amazing. We've got this number of interviews, that's great. I think, you know, the important bit, the true gold for me is in that analysis and that trend analysis and looking at those ratios and going, okay, well, you know, Bob might have sent out 100 spec CVs, but Bob got 2 interviews. Well, that tells me that Bob is either not identifying the right people to send them to, the candidate's not good enough, et cetera, et cetera. So I think as starting sort of overarching metrics, definitely, then the gold really comes into when you start getting down into the details of things and linking it together.
Absolutely. And there's a really good example to sort of give to that, right? Where you look at things in isolation. If you take revenue, for example, and say, great, all of our consultants are hitting target. What a wonderful time. But how many jobs are you burning to get that target? Or how many candidates are you losing to poor candidate experience throughout? You know, what are you doing to make sure more revenue will come in the future and that actually this isn't the last month of everyone hitting targets? That's where supporting metrics really have to come into play. So for me, when we did our survey, the next 4 metrics in terms of order of priority and how many clients had targets against them. First one was revenue. Again, unsurprisingly, after CVs interviews, it's super important that the business has the lifeblood to keep going. And interestingly, this one will surprise people. It's the number of calls that people were making. So actually a focus on that BD was a big one, not even just now, but last year as well. Maybe not so much held over a barrel if the number of calls weren't being done, but they've always been seen as important. Then we have placements or deals, depending on what you want to call them. And then we have the jobs get added, right? So I'd say none of that's really unsurprising, you know, jobs into CVs, into interviews, into placements and revenue, with calls being at the very start. It's a classic recruitment funnel, right? And I think everyone knows what that really is going to look like. That's it in its simplest form. And like you said, ratios is where it then starts to get really important. So 6 metrics to start. Go on, sorry.
I was going to say, I wanted to pick up on the ratios because I actually had a conversation with a client of mine this morning, an advisory client of mine, and we were having a discussion, let's put it that way, discussion, because their main sort of metric that they're tracking at the moment is they're really tracking around vacancies. So number of new vacancies, which is fine. And I understand that. I was emphasizing a little bit more on potentially we look at the activities to get us to those new vacancies, but we were going down that route. But again, we got into the whole ratios. And I said, well, that's fine. Okay, let's understand the vacancies, but then let's understand how much we need to do to get those vacancies. And now they are currently in a process where they've transitioned CRM a little while ago. The data is still being cleansed and stuff like that. And he said, it's very hard at the moment because I'm not confident in our data. Why would I bother even getting ratios when the data may or may not be good? My sort of counter to that was, we still want to look to have a baseline. Like a baseline level of activity. So, you know, is this going to be absolute? Is it, I do this, I definitely get that, and then I get that? No, it's not. Like, life is life, and recruitment is...
Exactly.
We can't control people. But where we need to start is we need a baseline understanding.
I completely agree. And there's kind of 2 points to this. Like, one is sometimes it's better to track something and be slightly off than to track nothing at all. Otherwise, you are genuinely flying blind. And two is just start tracking from day one. Like, even if you change definitions later down the line, like we've got, for example, we use HubSpot as our CRM, kind of like the system that I mentioned earlier on. There are definitely some numbers in there from previous years that are just going to make zero sense to us today. But things like revenue have always been a consistent measurement across time that we can do some analysis around. So even if you're not going to track it perfectly, there's a saying I use internally at my company a lot, which is lay the tracks once the train is moving. It's like watching Wallace and Gromit, if you remember the old school film, where he's laying the track as the train is literally flying along. It's just like that. You'd rather get the train moving so you can focus on growing and evolving rather than sitting there and spending 3-4 months going, well, our systems have got to be perfect. I've got to get that CRM, that thing in place over here. Then I can start worrying about what the metrics look like. No, start on it today. Worry about getting it right later on is the best way I can look at it. And kind of around the ratios that you mentioned, I completely agree as well. You've got those 6 main metrics, but there's sort of 4 connector metrics that come into that, right? Calls generate jobs. Jobs lead to CVs being sent, assuming you have good candidate flow as well. CVs being sent leads to interviews, and then interviews leads to placements and revenue, right? So in its purest form, that is recruitment. 6 metrics, 4 connectors, 10 things for you to track overall in total that really are your level 1 metrics, in my opinion. It's the baseline for you to know, have you got a business here that can scale and grow? Yeah. And I think for smaller businesses especially, that's enough. Like if you are less than, say, 10 heads, that is going to be enough. Don't kill yourself by trying to look at too much information. Just focus on getting the basics right. Now, when you're a 100-person company, it's a very different conversation, right? Because that's when you've got to start worrying about quality and things like that. But fundamentally, worry about those 10 as the main ones, because you can start looking at things again, like how many calls does it take to get a job on? How many CVs does it take to get an interview? How many interviews does it take to generate a placement or generate, 10 grand of revenue? Pick your number in there if you want. Doing a placement to £1 of revenue is going to give you a silly ratio, so don't worry about that too much. Now, in those 3 there, I did miss out jobs to CVs because, kind of like I said earlier on, jobs are only part of the picture because candidates are involved too, which is why recruitment can be more complicated. There's 2 different groups of people. You have to manage the client and the candidate, right? I think that one's actually better to flip, and this is where you'll align to this, is do CVs to jobs. How many CVs are you getting out of the door per job? And you can really start getting deeper on that if you want to go towards like level 2 metrics and say, okay, then for all the jobs we're currently working, how many CVs have been sent against each one? That's a good metric to have, because someone can send 100 CVs to one job when you've got 10 active and you go, great, I've got a 10-to-1 ratio. Everything looks sweet. This is where data can be deceiving. And sometimes you've got to dig that little bit deeper and actually go and look and not just trust what a number on a spreadsheet tells you, right? So never always believe like that a data will tell you everything. Sometimes it does require context as well.
I think it completely requires context. And I think that's a really good sort of analogy that you gave there about that 100 jobs to or 100 CVs to one job, because again, like if I think of some of the clients that I've worked with, a lot of the transition that they've gone through with their clients in this last period is they've had these big, huge, major accounts. And then all of a sudden they've kind of dried up and they've got quieter and quieter. And then when they start to actually look retrospectively back on the data, they've started to realize, oh my God, how many man hours did I put on this? Someone did send 100 CVs to one job. And it wasn't necessarily that the 100 CVs were bad, but it was actually kind of probably a bad client in terms of already starting to turn the tap off. We weren't on it. We weren't on top of the data. Then did we repurpose these candidates? Probably not. So that can be a real sort of, I suppose, shining light moment as to how good is your client. I hate to use that word, but maybe how good is the relationship, or is it functioning properly, or are they doing really well? It can just provide so much more context.
It can. I mean, ultimately, whatever metrics it's a really interesting conversation that could expand outside of just metrics to talking about like commission schemes that you use for recruiters in this new wonderful world of BD. And it's an area I'm really passionate about. Ultimately, your compensation plan, I think the guy who set the CRO of HubSpot at the time, one of the co-founders, said comp plan is the most effective weapon you will ever have in trying to get your team to do the right behaviors. Paraphrased, of course, but it really is. And I'll go into this a little bit later on as well if we have a bit of time. But if you want to drive the right behaviors, 1, comp for it. 2, make sure those metrics are what everyone can see. If you're trying to put a real focus on CV sent, people are just going to send tons of CVs. If you put it all down on interviews, that's kind of further down the funnel, and is probably what, again, in software we would call a lagging metric rather than a leading one. leading being ones that you can control today, things that you can do. You can send a CV, you can make a phone call. Lagging are things like deals, revenues, interviews, things that maybe you can't secure today, but leading leads into lagging a little bit later on down the line. So really trying to make sure you have a spread focus across things like interviews, like CVs, like calls and jobs on is really important. Just don't bombard someone with too many targets, because then their focus is just so diluted that they aren't saying, okay, what is really important to this company and my role? Pick out 3 to 5 that are really key to you and run at those, which is arguably why I get a little bit frustrated. You know, I'm not going to call out any clients by name here, but sometimes we'll go on and they've got like 40 targets across all these different note types inside of their CRM. And I'm just like, guys, this is so heavy. Like, where do they know where to focus? You're telling them to get 2 ref checks done this week, but to also get 5 reference calls from existing clients, whilst also making 60 phone calls to get a new job on. Like, where do you really want their time and energies to go? And this, I think, is arguably the biggest shift that we're going to see in recruitment. Some have already done it historically, but this sort of 180 model of like resourcing and consulting, that may even now become like a 120, 120, 120 model, which sounds crazy. But again, in software sales, we have a 180, 180, where you have meeting bookers, or those that are finding jobs, and those that are then converting them, right? So there is nothing wrong with hiring in SDRs. Like one of our clients said to me last week, hey, we're looking at doing this. Have their whole focus be finding the job, and then have your consultants essentially being air quotes AEs, whose job it is to take any candidates that have come through the website, through resources, whatever, and focus purely on that relationship. Because then you can give each of those different disciplines 3, 4, 5 metrics that really matter, rather than having a full 360 role that's got 15 metrics to worry about. It's too much diluted focus. You're trying to spread someone far too thin. Superstars might be able to keep up, but I feel you're just spreading people far too thin there. And really, you've got to narrow their focus down so they can be really good at one specific area.
I completely agree. And I think we're going to see a really interesting shift in the industry and what becomes the norm kind of moving forwards. But that's a whole other topic. We'll pick that up another time. But
I could talk forever about it, honestly. I think it's so fascinating.
I know. I find it incredibly fascinating.
One shout out I will give while I'm here quickly, and then we'll move on, I promise. I want to shout out one of the recruiters we did work with, actually, called Ingenio. They have something called a customer success manager, whose whole job is to make sure a client is successful with you, right? So I'm not being chased down by a consultant every 3 months saying, hey, you're hiring again. Hey, you're hiring again. Hey, you're hiring again. Success manager's job is to make sure we're getting on well with the new start. Do we need any additional support there? For example, if we've got any concerns, it's not really about securing new business. Admittedly, they did turn around eventually and say, have you got any more roles, which kind of defeated the point. But the CSM role, for example, for us is purely about supporting our customers to get more value out of our service. And recruiters could, again, learn a lesson from that. And I'm glad to see companies like Ingenio are starting to lean that way. A really fascinating mix.
I've actually got a client of mine that's just introduced that role as well. And I thought that was really interesting. And also as well, to have a better understanding of their sort of client collective. So doing data and analysis work over, okay, this relationship's performing well from a data perspective. This one isn't, why not? And getting into the nuts and bolts of that.
I mean, the sad thing in a way is that some consultants simply aren't going to be amazing relationship builders. Salespeople, yes, but are they someone that, there's a reputation about a lot of recruiters. We all know this, where it's like they're only there to try and get jobs off you, essentially, right? They're going to bombard you with CVs until you hire someone and that's it. I think that whole customer success manager or CSM relationship is really valuable because the client knows that's a safe person to talk to who only have their best interests at heart. And it feels weird, and maybe in some cases it's hard to fit inside a budget, for example, for a recruiter. But having someone whose sole focus when you're trying to differentiate yourself is on supporting the customer, that is a really valuable USP that very few companies will be able to offer these days.
Yeah, because the conversation will be a totally different dynamic. Totally different. But look,
have the consultant come in and say any new jobs that you want me to work, and it's totally fine.
Well, this is it. Yeah, exactly. You are going to get something from it. Go on.
Absolutely.
But what I was keen to kind of dive into next, because this was certainly came up a lot in my advisory that I was doing, like I'm thinking probably end of last year, it started to come about even more and more, was getting visibility. So actually, like, it's all well and good, like I'm going to have these metrics and stuff, but it's like, well, how am I going to gather all the data? Like, I had a client of mine who said exactly that. I'm pretty sure everyone does all of this. We're performing really well, but it's starting to drop a bit. But I don't know why it's dropping a bit, because we've not really been pulling the data and we've not been looking at it. But the idea of going and doing it is way too cumbersome, and I'd rather just get everyone doing more. Basically do more better, essentially. So
if only it were that easy.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a key thing, I think, is like, as you said, simplifying it. So not bombarding, simplifying it, but then also like, what's your thoughts and takes on the best way to kind of pull all that information together? And also probably as well to disseminate that information or share that information.
I'm going to have a real controversial take here as someone that sells software that helps recruiters with analytics, and that is to not buy a system. So many companies rush out there to buy a platform that think is going to solve a problem they've got, when in reality, the problem needs to be properly assessed. Take a step back, and often what you'll realize that actually it's a process problem, not a system problem. So you've got to get the process right first and then find a solution that can map around the way that you do things. So when I say this, what you probably want to be thinking about first and foremost is, again, what are the most important metrics to you? I'm biased. I gave my 10 earlier on. There may be other things that are more important to you based on what sector you sell into, what type of recruitment you do. Just think about what you want those things to be, because the 10 that I gave were very focused around perm. Most of our clients are perm. So get those really clear in your head. And then what you want to do is in my opinion, anyway, we still do this as a company even today, even with a system like HubSpot in place, is we have a Google sheet that once a week, my leadership team at 10:30 a.m., pretty much on the dot, come in and populate their numbers against 5 or 6 metrics against their area of concern. We've got 5 or 6 areas of concern, so about 30 metrics in total. We then have a meeting at 12 o'clock every single week where we sit down and we go through those numbers. And I can see literally for the 13 weeks of a quarter, side by side, how are the numbers changing across those weeks? And really the exercise behind this is that we don't spend half an hour talking about numbers. I scroll down it and go, okay, then what numbers look different to last week? What's changed? What do I need to probe into here? So let's say, for example, we get 120 odd support tickets a week, and one week it's up to 250. And I go to Emma, my head of customer success, and go, Emma, this is your number. Give us context. What's happened? Mm-hmm. And she has her own scorecard inside of her team that she meets with on a Monday morning before our leadership meeting, where she has got more context. So she might know, okay, then what's our satisfaction rating for all the chats that we closed last week, or what's the average time to close, things like that. So she has that context. And if I ask, she just goes, okay, then, well, it was double because it was quarter end. People want more questions around their data. More people are logging back in who have forgotten their password, for example. All these little things like that come up. But it's just a sanity check to go, okay, then that red flag is raising a little bit here to say something looks wrong. Can you tell me that you've got it under control, or do we need to talk about this further and find an action to remedy it, right? So I think having that weekly chat with either your managers or your leadership team, whichever way you structure your business, is the most important thing that you'll do, just to make sure you're at least talking about the data. Otherwise, it lives in a spreadsheet. You get the odd email sent around, 2 or 3 days later, the information is completely out of date already. It just doesn't feel right. And if you want to, you can even do this weekly. So if we have an underperformer in the business, or someone that we want to monitor who's taking on a new role of some kind, we'll have a daily scorecard where we say at 4:30 each day, please fill in these 5 metrics, and we'll have a 5-minute conversation at 5 to 5 going through those metrics with you. And we'll just talk about it and go, cool, so here are the numbers you got today. That's below where you were recently. Why is that? And just help to understand the context. And it really drives ownership in the individual, right?
Yeah.
So my view is do it manually. Don't get too complicated about it. Don't go out there and buy a tool like OneUp out the gate, or buy a really fancy CRM that can do all your reporting for you. Just focus on getting the numbers first and foremost. If your CRM can't get these numbers out, then buy a different CRM, plain and simple.
Yeah.
Get those numbers out and just talk about them, but keep it simple again to 5 or 6 per area of concern, or 10 that you might focus on, like the ones I mentioned earlier. Keep it simple, stupid. It really is as basic as that, and talk about them. If you do want to dive deeper, that's what we'll get into in a minute. That does involve getting normally some more complex reporting in place. That's where you see the big, massive sprawling spreadsheets that some recruiters have got, or systems that can help you out with that sort of thing. But at least at a starting point, get the process right first. Have that weekly conversation with your leadership team. Have the daily, if you need to, one-to-one with team members, if you really feel like that's the right thing to do. And then you can start to scale it up over time.
Yeah. I'm interested to get your take on, like, one of the things that I've kind of seen recently and discussed as well with clients is trying to use the data as, how am I going to phrase this right? Encouragement for gentle competition, so shall we say? Because,
absolutely.
Previously when times are good, data kind of goes out the window. Everyone's like, oh, we're amazing. The famous recruitment phrase, champagne and razor blades. So we're all having champagne. We're having a brilliant time. You don't have to worry about it so much. But when things start to turn a bit, people sometimes want to use that data to, I suppose, encourage maybe lower performers or mid performers to kind of step up. Also, as well, that leads to a whole other conversation about performance management, which actually recruitment isn't always the best at or whatever, but that's a side topic. So instead, they kind of want to use this tool or whatever tool or mechanism to kind of shine a light on it without directly having the conversation.
Yes, this is why our podcast that we run is called the Carrot and Stick Podcast, is because data can be used as a carrot or as a stick, depending on how you want to use it.
Yeah.
And really, in my opinion, the way that we've always advised our customers, we, inside our products, I'm not all trying to sell the products here, but I need to do it to get the context out. We have a view that we encourage most of them to set up where you'll have CVs, then you'll have your CVs to interviews ratio, then your number of first interviews, then your interviews to placements ratio, and finally your number of placements and revenue that comes off the back of that. And the reason why we encourage this is if you sit down in a one-to-one with someone, and we really encourage data transparency, let everyone see what everyone else is doing. Yeah. People always get worried like, they'll just look at everyone else all the time and we'll do no work. Not really. And if they are looking, it tends to be because they're curious to see what the best performers are doing. Number one lesson in sales, get near the best performers, learn from them, right? Yeah. So we always say, sit down in your one-to-one. And if someone goes to you, look, I'm making a fifth of what this guy over there is doing. He's our top performer. It's not fair. How do I get near that? You can sit down and go, right, well, let's look at the numbers, right? So this is how many placements you've got versus them. Here's where your ratios might fall down in the middle. So you're sending 10 CVs to get an interview. They're sending 4. Then when it comes to their interviews, they're on a 2-to-1 interview to placement ratio. You're on 7-to-1. Yeah. It becomes really transparent then when who the low performers in the team are and where they're falling short, and ultimately where they could do some additional training versus what the best players are doing, right? Yeah. And sometimes, again, it can just be a case of asking on that, run a team session, sit down for, I know a company called Refract who are like, they got acquired, bless them, into a Lego. But they used to do on a Friday afternoon, like a team dissection of calls, for example, looking at numbers. Just sit down and really go into what are the best performers doing, understand in Refract's case, what does a good demo look like? How can we improve on it? Or in the case of recruiters, what are the best players doing? What can they be doing? Now, there's probably a piece there around culture as well. Does the top performer really want to share? Do they want to give away their secrets? Maybe no. But that's where culture becomes really important and making sure you are driving the right behaviors and hiring the right people. Recruiters should be really good at that, you'd hope, right? So that's a large piece of it.
Yeah, you'd hope. I think that training piece you mentioned is really key, because I pull into that a lot when I speak to them about the importance of the data, but not only the data, the analysis piece, because I'm like, for you to best support and upskill your people, if you don't know the specific area of where it's falling down in the process, it's very hard, So it's like, as you say, perfect example, 7-to-1 ratio. Well, there's a quality issue there.
Yes.
That kind of thing. So we can dive specifically into that. And it's also on the flip side, it's a great opportunity for people that want to progress their recruitment career, and they maybe want to move up to manager, director, and all of that need that mentorship experience to go, okay,
absolutely.
Well, Sally, you're amazing at that. You've got a really good ratio. Bob's really struggling. Could we partner you guys together? Could you do some work on it?
Completely agree. Completely agree. But it's a really good point around that sort of data side of things, just for a quick second on that as well. Because let's choose a theoretical example and say interviews are falling off a cliff, which I'm sure many have experienced over the last 6 months with the whole market falling off the face of the earth. If they're falling, first, it's not good. Second, what's causing it? And that's where data can help, right? Yeah. So are we still getting the same volume of CVs out that we were before? If we are, what are the reasons for why interviews are going down? Why is that ratio dropping off the face of the earth? Is it they're all going to 1 or 2 jobs instead of being spread properly? That's where the ratios can help. Or, as many of us experienced, our clients freezing their hiring. Sometimes you get to a point where data will only get you so far. And sometimes you've just got to go and ask questions, right? And I don't just mean internally. I mean, pick up the phone and speak to your customers. There's a saying that I love. No one ever went out of business for speaking to their customers too much. Yeah. Just ask what's going down to really get that understanding. And if you've got such a large team that you can't really afford to do that, go and ask your teams, ask your managers to ask their ICs, the consultants at the end of the tree, what are you seeing in the market? Give me a report on the last 10 placements that you lost or won. What were the reason we lost or won them? What is going on in the market? Get all that condensed together across your managers, and you've got a really good view there of why are we losing things or why are we winning things. And that will give you a much better view of the market with qualitative information rather than just raw numbers and quantitative information.
Yeah, completely. And I think that's like a very nice sort of transition as well into, we've talked about sort of what to pull together. We've talked about sort of how to pull it together. But, at the end of the day, we want to make it impactful. So we want it to actually have an impact on the sales performance of teams and things like that. So, we've discussed, I suppose, tidbits throughout of this implementation of the data and stuff like that. But what are some of the other thoughts that you have around making sure that, the stats, how you've collected them, then actually turn into something really useful.
So you're talking more here about motivating people with that information.
Completely, yeah.
Yeah, there's so many layers to this. Honestly, I could be here for hours talking about it. One, as we all know, is running incentives, right? You know, there's a very common like power hours or call blitzes that we see in software where for 2 or 3 hours, you set fun incentives. And again, to give a shout out to Allego, you know, Richard, if he's listening to this, I doubt he is, but if he is, bless his heart and soul, he used to do something where they would give one of their consultants or SDRs or whatever you want to call them, a budget of say 100 quid or 200 quid and say, right, you theme this blitz of this like call blitz that we're going to do. You can choose the prizes for it. You can choose silly prizes, serious ones. The whole goal is make it as fun as you want. And that used to be on the last Friday of every month. And it was always be based around a theme. So like cowboys or space or whatever it might be. And people would come in dressed up and make it a really fun occasion. Don't make it feel like, again, the stick thing where it's like stand up and you can't sit down until you've booked a meeting. Like that's not the way to do it. You can do that when it's kind of like done across the team and they've all bought into a funny idea. Not really super embarrassing, but something to have a laugh over if someone can't do something or if they do achieve something. Just find ways to have fun with it. And there are loads of ideas out there. Ask ChatGPT. It will give you loads of ideas on this sort of thing. But probably largely outside of running competitions and call blitzes. One thing I will touch on, and I don't want to go massively into it because it is aside from this main topic, is honestly look at your commission scheme. I said it earlier on. It is the biggest driver of behavior that you want. If you want people to get jobs on, incentivize that. We have this again in software where we give commission to SDRs when they book a meeting and they get a small part of the deal revenue when it actually closes. Their main chunk of commission comes from booking in demos. So whether you say, right, we will give you 50 quid when a job that you add on gets an interview arranged for it or a CV gets sent to it, whatever you choose it to be, just find something that kind of verifies that the job coming in is good and then say, right, now you'll earn your commission. Because for them, it's going to incentivize things much more upfront. We as humans, we do things, we like immediate feedback. Think about social media. You post a picture, people start mashing the like button. You're like, yeah, it's really successful. You want to go and do it again, right? It's exactly the same in sales. If you're bringing the reward closer to the action that led to that reward being generated, they'll want to do it more and more. Real basic human psychology. But let's try and think about how we can incentivize people beyond just the end result, the revenue, and focus instead on bringing things forward. And that is a little I suppose, teaser of what I'm giving to our client who's hired this SDR that I'll say to him next week is you need to incentivize on jobs being added to your system because that is what you want that person to focus on. They don't care about revenue. It's so far away. They're not involved. Focus on what they can control.
Yeah, completely. And I spoke with a client of mine about this the other day about incentives in particular. And they were like, oh, we're struggling. The team aren't really kind of buying into the incentives that we're doing. And we dove into them. The incentives that they were doing were quarterly. I'm like, that's so long. I'm like, oh my God. If I'm a salesperson, I don't care about 3 months' time. I was like, we came up with a strategy where even I was like, have a quarterly incentive, like a big one, something big quarterly. But I was like,
if you do something quarterly, have it be a team-based thing. So everyone's in it together.
We spoke, about that, the individual and team side. But I was also like, do as well, if you want to drive particular behaviors at certain times, like do 2-week sprints, do mini sprints and go, right.
I guess I used to be a developer. Sprints are like my home. We've got so many teams in our company that do 2-week sprints and it's really valuable.
Completely. And then have something that it's that immediate gratification. I was like, if you tell me I'm going to get a weekend away, even in Paris, I don't know, but it's in 3 months' time, I'm not going to care.
Yeah, exactly that. It's too far away to the rewards.
By the time I care about it, half the quarter's already gone, or 2/3 of the quarters are already gone.
That's it. Or people give up inside a month. If they realize they're only at 5% of what they need to get to that incentive, they'll just give up. Or if they can see someone else has pulled far ahead, they'll give up. And this is why these short 2 or 3 hour call blitzes, for example, or things that are really close term, those are the best things that you can run to incentivize activity there and now.
And that's also as well interesting when you said about that, about someone either pulling ahead or this sort of thing. So my recommendation to this and another client was also, don't just have like a first prize, have a second prize.
Yes.
Because again, if you have just one prize up for grabs and someone is smashing it and they've run away with it, everyone else for the next 2 weeks or 10 days is going to go, oh, well, Derry's absolutely killed it. I'm going to have no chance. You always want to feel like there's that opportunity of, oh, well, I could get that one. Or, that sort of thing, because you don't want it to fall dead in the water because you have an amazing performer. Good job.
That's it. Or do first, second, third. So you're incentivizing people to, again, fight for like a podium style finish. You can have like a little ceremony at the end. You can have a lot of fun with it. Use the fact that you're in office as well. Like we are a hybrid team, so we have our own ideas and how we motivate staff. If you're in office still and are most of the time, have fun with it. Use what you've got, right?
Yeah, this is it completely. So any other tips and tricks that you have for how best to kind of like motivate using the information?
I think really, again, if you come back to the point I mentioned earlier on about looking at ratios up and down the team and who the top performers are and learning from them, it very much becomes not a stick piece. It becomes a carrot piece of saying, hey, I want you to get better. I'm your friend in this, essentially, right? I want you to improve. Don't sit there and be like, you didn't hit your targets. Why are you doing such a crap job? That is never going to motivate someone in this day and age, right? Some it might, but I'd argue for most, it will not. Use it as much more of a supporting piece and show why they should be doing something. That's the one thing I think a lot of leaders really get wrong is the why or the context, right? So we're slapping a target around this. Why are we setting that as a target? And I think if you help people understand, here's the impact it has on the business if we get this right, they get much more bought into that because their purpose as a human then goes beyond just them as an individual and what they can earn. It expands to arguably the team, if not the whole company. That will get them much more bought into what it is that you're trying to achieve. So definitely try and explain the why. That is number one for me, always.
Yeah. And I think that also ties in with, if you are still bringing in relative juniors or you're upskilling juniors as well, that's really impactful in getting them to upskill is you get them to understand more around that why, you get them to build on that commercial acumen, and you get them to understand that all the elements of the process, how connected they are, and the difference that they make at the beginning will have that difference at the end. And I think so many people, if I even think when I started back in agency recruitment in good old Hayes, where I used to cry at lunchtime because they would take my chair away because I didn't make enough BD calls, but it was always like, you have to do these numbers. And it was kind of, I suppose, unfortunately, a parenting thing that sometimes I fall into when my kids go, why? And I just say, because I said so.
Exactly. And they're not motivated by that.
This is it, and my kids don't get motivated by that. They continue to ask me why. So, I think that is so, so key.
And this is exactly what Mark, our SDR team lead, did about 6 months ago. I think it was back maybe just before Christmas. He sat down the team and said, look, here's how you can earn 20 grand extra this year, for example. If you can get this many demos in to get this much commission, that's how much you'll earn. To do that, you've got to send this many emails, make this many calls based on historic data we've got. Here is your path to earning 20 grand. And everyone was like, right, I'm making 80 calls tomorrow then, because they can see again exactly what that path is they need to walk down. You don't give them that why in that broader context and just say, you got to make 80 calls because I said so. They'll be like, well, screw you. Why would I do that?
Yeah, completely. And I think as well, we spoke about before and tying this back in about my client who was like, why would I get ratios off of potentially bad data or whatever, and creating this baseline. And we went through the importance of the baseline, but I also always come back to people with marginal gains. So much gets changed in your business by small marginal gains. And I think a lot of people think that it's got to be an overhaul or, we got to do this completely differently, or we got to do this, but times 10x it, all of this sort of stuff. When actually the truth is, if you make these small marginal gains consistently across a collective, it will have a huge impact.
1% better every day. It's something that our SDR team does is they spend 12 p.m. till 12:30 p.m. every day reviewing calls from that morning. Like they'll have a different SDR each day that has to bring 2 or 3 calls, and they'll sit down together and go, what could we improve on? And the goal of that is that everyone takes away a lesson they can then go and use in their afternoon call session. So the learning is being applied pretty much straight away after a little breather. And then they'll roll that into every single day going forwards. And again, the idea is 1% better every day. Over time, that becomes a massive gain.
Yeah, completely. Well, look, I really appreciate it. I'm going to wrap us up there for today. We've gone into quite a bit and lots of spin-off tangents. So I'm sure
honestly, I could talk for hours about this stuff. I absolutely love it.
I love it. We could do 180 models. We could do commissions. We've got so much other things we can do in the future. But look, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your thoughts. Obviously, if anyone's interested in finding out more, they can follow you on LinkedIn.
Or drop me a DM. Again, people interested in like customer success managers, AEs, SDRs, anything and how you can roll that into your business, hit me up. Always happy to chat.
Perfect. Well, look,